Even before the entire universe decided that it should be a question with a lot more weight, I'd been thinking about what brings us back to fantastical settings, and I think I can blame Henry Cavill. He's far from the first mainstream celebrity to have the sorts of esoteric hobbies we might call nerdy, but he's maybe the first one who's this mainstream and this passionate and esoteric in his nerdiness. Vin Diesel talking about getting Judi Dench to play D&D on the set of The Chronicles of Riddick is one thing, and granted, we're now into the second decade of your boomer aunts having a favorite Avenger, but it's quite a bit different having a cultural icon like Superman explaining his preferred army in fucking 40K. This has led me to getting the chance to talk about my own nerdy esotericisms to people. What appeals to be found in them, and what brings people back to them. Lots of appeals for lots of passions. A lot of us have been explaining them to people, and a common thing said of people who are passionate about Final Fantasy XIV is that they enjoy the story, and it does sound pretty extraordinary when they talk about it. In my time in the game's world, I've spearheaded the overthrowing of an occupying regime, brought peace to a millennium-long war with dragons, and ignited hope in despair's dominion at the very edge of existence. The big stories people expect. What most people don't expect is how many more stories you become a part of, how literally everything is connected to a story. As a result, I've also dismantled a dangerous superweapon program, been a key supporter in efforts to rebuild a war-ravaged region and reclaim its devastated and suppressed culture, and helped a group of hippo-racing elephant people turn their passion into a vital and welcome part of their new community. That last one may sound a bit silly, but like I've noted before, silliness is not a bug of what I'm calling epic mode stories like Final Fantasies or most fantastical series and settings. People thinking they're cool and above something may put on a stupid voice describing them, and I admit I've done this too, but that doesn't diminish what these stories can do. In fact, there is one element of nearly every story in 14 that I think is a big part of what brings us back. And to illustrate, I think I should talk about the time I helped a bunny and a robot open a coffee shop for ghosts. First, the bunny, or more accurately, the Loporrit. When the final days came to the ancients, only one among them had knowledge of what they truly portended. The ancient Vana knew that the carnage and destruction were signs that, as promised, the despairing song of the media, a hopeful experiment gone horribly, horribly wrong, had reached them, and her fellows' plans would be insufficient to stop it. The best chance at overcoming the crisis lay in a mysterious warrior from the future only she recalled. But rather than pin all her hopes there, Vana formulated a backup scheme to save the people of Atheris, so she created the Loporrits. Yes, these little guys were instantly a huge hit. The Loporrits were tasked with converting the moon into a habitat and an ark that the peoples of the world could use to evacuate the planet and flee to the stars. But then that mysterious warrior came along with a much better plan. Good thing, because the very well-intentioned Loporrits didn't really understand the peoples of the world all that well. Regardless, the world was saved. The Loporrits played a crucial role in saving it, but now their task was unnecessary. For the first time in their existence, they'd have to decide what to do with themselves. Oh wow, a fantasy setting with a servitor species, but through the actions of the hero, they are freed from service and given self-determination. How crazy is that? One of these Loporrits was Jammingway. They'd helped in the quest to reach the edge of the cosmos, and like the rest of the Loporrits, wondered what they might do now. Many of the Loporrits decided to first visit the planet they had long gazed at from afar, and walk among the people they'd been preparing to care for but never met, which was wonderful for a Loporrit as curious as Jammingway. And one of the first things they found was a wondrous place. A restaurant, which hilariously seems to have the menu of a pretty basic and a very unfocused bar and grill. But as Jammingway saw it, it was a place people gathered together to share food, drink, and company, and reasons to meet again. It was a place that would stay with them. Haunted places are a staple of fantasy fiction, and 14 has several. but none feel quite as haunted as Ultima Thule. When the media announced,
"We will make our nest at the edge of the universe, and there in the dark of dead worlds hoard sorrow and suffering."
Ultima Thule is where they made that nest, built around a dying sun constructed of a sort of magical energy called dynamis that was affected by emotion and could warp reality. And so there, the despairing memories of the media were manifested, and the wreckage of long-dead civilizations shuffled on in the misery and torment of their last throes again. There were the dragons of the Dragonstar, whose long life had become a curse as an invasion had rendered their world uninhabitable, and they could only watch as clutches of eggs withered and were still and wait for their own end. And there were the Ea, who thought they had achieved immortality by disconnecting from the physical, only to realize they could not cheat the heat death of the universe, and suddenly their sacrifices had been in vain. Deeper still within the nest were memories of the diseased Grebulovs, the Corellians who had torched their world and themselves in a conflagration of hate, and the Nibiran who had banished all their sorrows and all their joys along with them, and left themselves so aimless for so long, they created death and embraced its release from their stultifying existence eagerly. So at the far edge of the cosmos, where sorrow and despair ruled, these sorrowful and despairing ghosts trudged about. But the memory that clearly haunted the media the most was empty. One had found a planet with buildings, but no people. No bodies, no remains, no wreckage or records, just the buildings, as if the people who made them vanished in an instant and left only this trace behind, a riddle to torment them for eternity. These long-lost civilizations couldn't be said to live again, but some aspect of them existed again, and in one case, that was a big concern. The Omicrons of the planet Alphatron vowed never to be conquered again. Frail and weak, they had been easy targets for the other species of their world, and to defend themselves, they augmented their own bodies and minds with metal and machinery. Now across Alphatron, the Omicrons did the conquering. With their augmented processing power, they knew that out there in the darkness of space, there must be other, stronger sentient species lurking. So their command units programmed for themselves an overriding imperative: become the strongest, so none can conquer us ever again. The Omicrons took to the stars as a perfectly calibrated machine of war. We get glimpses and snippets of an Omicron conquest, but the details are unimaginably horrific. We're told that a standard strategy was to drop factories the size of small continents from orbit into oceans, flash evaporating them in an instant. And soon the invaded would be facing hordes of their own heavily modified people as the Omicron command units subsumed whatever they deemed valuable into their matrix. And so this wave of metal swept across the universe. Become the strongest, so no one can conquer us. And world after world fell. Eventually, the Omicrons darkened the skies of the Dragonstar, and here it seemed they had perhaps found the life forms they had feared for millennia. For the placid but mighty dragons were roused to put up a fearsome resistance. For centuries, the Omicrons and dragons fought, until the Omicron command units determined they had won. The Dragonstar had been ravaged past their use, and could no longer support the dragon eggs either. So the Omicrons left, victorious. Technically. They had defeated what they saw as the strongest life forms in the universe. No one could conquer them. We actually know some of this story already. We met two survivors of this conflict: Midgar Sormer, the dragon who fled to the source of the clutch of eggs, and Omega, the Omicron superweapon who pursued him and would end up causing a lot of problems we face over the story, including, indirectly, that superweapon program I mentioned. The rest of the Omicrons didn't care much about Midgar Sormer. After all, they'd done it. They'd won. But you know what happens when there are no worlds left to conquer? Its purpose fulfilled, the Omicron Command Unit Stigma 1 was unable to determine a future course of action. Too late did the emptiness of their old course occur to it. So it disconnected itself, and left the entirety of the Omicron race in standby mode, running themselves down in a perpetual low-power loop, awaiting orders that would never come. And that's how the media found them, and brought the memory of Stigma 1 and the rest of the Omicrons to Ultima Thule. This is where I come in. Yes, I'm using the first person here, as this is about the actual experience. Deal with it. Stories are rarely over. Ending a millennium-long war with dragons didn't also end a millennium of hate and loss and bereavement. The Empire was never going to let a liberated province stay liberated uncontested. And bringing hope to despair's dominion at the edge of existence had consequences too. It all started when Jammingway asked for my help. Curious about what had become of Ultima Thule, they had sent out a probe and were shocked when it sent back a distress signal. So they enlisted the help of the great adventurer to investigate. We soon discovered the distress signal was sent by the Omicron strategy unit N7000. It turns out that the manifested memories in Ultima Thule remained even after ending the Song of the Media, and its end had broken Stigma 1's impasse. The command unit had sent out one final command: live. This command had reached the logistics constructor Stigma 4, who took this command to mean they should proceed as usual, so it started up and began producing weapons again. Oops. With N7000's help, we're able to convince Stigma 4 to stop producing war units and start producing diplomatic units, thus averting another Omicron conquest. Threat dealt with, mission accomplished. With that, N7000 prepared to power down again. But Jammingway was quick to point out this contradicted Stigma 1's orders. N7000 was in need of a new purpose, and Jammingway proposed it could be found in helping the specters of Ultima Thule. After all, one had just nearly destroyed existence again, who knew what the others might unwittingly do? But what would N7000 actually do? Why, the answer was clear, at least by the logic of a lunar bunny. Open a cafe. The kind of place Jammingway saw people gather to share food, drink, company, and reasons to meet again. What better way to inspire hope in the remnants of civilizations that had lost all of it? Lunar bunny logic? Absolutely, but beautiful at the same time. Did I happen to know of a space in Ultima Thule where they could easily set up? I did indeed. With some help from the Omicron databanks and Sigma 4's fabricators, Jammingway and N7000 quickly had a functioning cafe. The last dregs, they cleverly called it. And things were not going swimmingly, at least partially because the only offerings on the menu were carrots and lubricant, but also because their customers remained locked in their despair. But the two had created a bright spot within the darkness, and Jammingway was dedicated to its purpose. So Ultima Thule itself lent a hand. The dynamis magic that suffused Ultima Thule was very responsive to emotion. When we say it's a place ruled by despair, that's the case, but only because that's all the media found in their journeys. So in response, the dynamis created monuments to death. From Jammingway's hope, it created a space for life. Jammingway dubbed this new region Elysion, and according to N7000 scans, things could be grown there. Fortunately, there was someone on hand who, among their many skills, counted growing things. Thus, we were able to promise the Dregs' earliest customers, a pair of Corellians from opposing sides of their apocalyptic war, a proper meal if they laid down their weapons. And once they do, a small piece of their home sprung back to life on Elysion, manifested by their own hopes and memories. So we have to set to work, finding things for the last Dregs that will inspire hope in these poor ghosts. The Grebuloffs mourned their lost ocean, but I was able to evoke the smell of one, and their yearning created one at Elysion. The Ia had abandoned physical sensation long ago, but they were able to read the feeling of taste in others, and this actually springs forth potentially a whole new species the Ia could care for. In their way. When we first approached the dragons, they couldn't even be roused to anger that one of the beings that had cost them their world was among us. But I shared with them tales of Midgar Swarmer and the new home he found for his clutch, and we designed a dessert that evoked the mountains of the Dragon Star. And at Elysion, baby dragons hatched. The Nibiron who had embraced the emptiness of death found themselves basking in the promise of new life. Each culture reshaped dynamis to manifest their newfound hopes. All this gave N7000 a lot to think about. Enough to get it stuck in a processing loop. The experience of helping to manage the last dregs, poring over data of what these peoples had been and watching what they were becoming, had given it a lot to consider. It had deemed helping Jammingway a reasonable interpretation of Stigma 1's order, live. And now that this mission was accomplished, Omicron Protocol demanded it upload its data and enter hibernation mode. Yet part of N7000 didn't accept this as following that order. It made a pilgrimage to the same tree records indicated Stigma 1 frequently visited. But like the command unit, it still found itself at an impasse. It had been considering unrealized potential and possibility, and the fact that it could consider these things led to an overwhelming possibility. It could change and feel hope. It was overwhelmed enough, N7000 overheated and went into safe mode, but when Jamming Away and I revived it, it had to accept the truth, because its hopes had also reshaped Elysion. It had started with a bored bunny, and it doesn't really end. Jamming Away intends to keep the last dregs open to the end of the universe, which is something the place is probably helping to forestall, and in its reckoning, N7000 had also reckoned with how much unrealized potential the Omicrons had created, and regarded continuing operation of the cafe as a sort of penance, a new way for its people. But even if I'm an honorary manager, and the pair are always glad to see me, my part in the story was done. The little bright spot in the darkness couldn't be turned off. Jamming Away had created what had amazed him, a place people gather to share food, drink, and company, and reasons to meet again. This was the story of the Omicron Tribal Quests, released as part of the Endwalker expansion. Tribal Quests are a traditional addition in each expansion. Most of them are pretty good, but the Omicrons have been my favorite. It starts at a goofy place, but like I said, this isn't a bug of stories like this, it's often a feature. It didn't preclude the story from touching on some real darkness and reaching some real sentiment. My retelling couldn't get into how it really feels to see Elysion change, to witness how childlike the Grebulovs turned out to be, and to catch glimpses of long-ruined worlds as they once were. But to me, it was very impactful. There's even, unsurprisingly, a musical element. Ultima Thule famously has a theme that develops and fills as you progress through its environs, so that by the time you're making your solo ascent, you're hearing the full version, which many interpret as a song sung to you by the companions who sacrificed themselves to bring you here.
Whispers falling silently drift on the wind, but I hear you on a journey, now a memory fading from sight, but I see you.
And this theme gets refigured in the last dregs in Elysion. I'll leave you to determine the significance of this for yourself. I remember the first time I walked by this Nibiron and noticed what it was saying. We once had cuisine. It's very sad, and we can't change any of the bad things that happened. But we did do something. Someone came to us with a vision of how to make the world a slightly better place, or a universe in this case. And we helped them do it. A whole lot of 14 side quests and stories begin with that. Someone has a hope, a desire, an idea to make the world a better place, and we help them do it. We're known for doing so, famous for doing so. It feels pretty nice. So why do we come back to these spaces? I can't speak to Warhammer 40k, but this one, the community is mostly wonderful. New things to do keep coming. I like how it plays, and I'm decently good at it. I'm a longtime fan of this form and this series. But at heart, who doesn't want to be an adventurer? It's an old dream this genre has long tapped, to wear a sword instead of a walking stick. Visiting faraway lands and people, learning histories nearly forgotten, facing challenges no one else can. Those are the pleasures you expect. But becoming a figure people turn to when they want the world to be better, that's something uplifting that stays with you outside of this world.